A new prime minister was finally chosen at the end of April 2006. Nouri al-Maliki, a little-known figure, was chosen to replace Ibrahim al-Jafari.
Well, we hadn't heard about him because he was a covert operative. He was very important, and he was interviewed before the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and it was clear that he was in favor of it. He served then, at the time of the Jafari government, as a member of the de-Baathification Committee. He had been based in Damascus. He had been in Tehran a bit, but he was mainly based in Damascus, and so he wasn't really in the Iran sphere of influence.
Muqtada al-Sadr, the cleric the U.S. had shunned for so long, was the real power behind Maliki's rise to prominence. By the end of May, a national unity government was formed 5 months after the elections had taken place. It included 6 Sunni ministers. Al-Maliki's premiership got off to a good start. Soon after the formation of the government, Al-Qaeda and Iraq leader Abu Musab al-Zarqawi was killed. His hideout targeted by an American airstrike.
I think along the way, the Zarqawi story yielded a lot of propaganda profit for the Americans because they were able to use him to suggest that Al-Qaeda had a large and pervasive role in Iraq, which in fact it didn't. They were able to disguise to some extent the scale of the homegrown Iraqi insurgency by using the Zarqawi story to imply that all this activity was Al-Qaeda.
His death didn't have any immediate effect on the overwhelming bloodshed. But in Washington, it was trumpeted as a big victory in the so-called War on Terror. And a week later, on June 13th, George Bush made a surprise visit to Baghdad to bolster support for the new prime minister.
It's in our interest that Iraq succeed. It's not only in the interest of the Iraqi people, it's in the interest of the American people and for people who love freedom.
But al-Maliki had inherited a country on the verge of collapse. Baghdad was the front line of the sectarian war that was spreading to other areas of the country. By summer 2006, the capital had been divided along religious lines. After centuries of peaceful cohabitation and even intermarriages, Sunni and Shia civilians were forcibly separated.
When you see your neighbor are forced to leave his house without carrying any of his luggage and not knowing where to go, not having enough money to rent a new house. A house is not just a building, it's your life, it's your memory. And we're watching them. We can't do anything to help them. We cannot protest against this. It's a bad feeling. It's a very bad feeling.
Entire families were being displaced. Hundreds of thousands of people fled in fear, leaving their homes and livelihoods behind. Those who were still living in Baghdad had become front-row witnesses to the horrors unfolding in the capital.
To see gunmen swooping down on an innocent civilian or riddling him with bullets or kidnapping him to the unknown is a horrible scene. The explosions were horrible too. Everyone feared for their lives. We just didn't know why the killings or kidnappings were happening. All of us were left in a state of horror.
The body count was staggering. Over the summer of 2006, an average of 100 Iraqis were being killed in Baghdad every day. In July alone, more than 3,400 Iraqis died, and there were about 1,600 attacks. Corpses laying in the streets of the capital became an all-too-common sight.
The UN did an investigation in summer of 2006 of the bodies that were showing up in the streets of Baghdad in the morning. Typically they were bound, they showed signs of torture, they had been shot once behind the ear, mafia style. Information had been extracted from them and then they were discarded. They showed signs of chemical burns, electrical burns, drilling. These are the techniques of torture. The two communities were torturing each other.
With residents confined to their sectarian districts, most of these bodies remained unclaimed. Mass graves once again became a reality in Iraq, an echo of the Saddam era. Hundreds of unclaimed corpses were taken 200 kilometers away from Baghdad to be buried at the edge of the desert. Their identities reduced to a number on a body bag, in case one day when the fighting stops, someone identifies their remains. Sunnis and Shias united in death, just like they used to be in life before the invasion. Finally, in a split with official policy, the US top military brass acknowledged that the risk of civil war was very real.
I believe that the sectarian violence is probably as bad as I've seen it in Baghdad in particular, and that if not stopped, it is possible that Iraq could move towards civil war.
In response, in mid-August 2006, US and Iraqi forces launched Operation Together Forward. Over 50,000 US and Iraqi soldiers poured into Baghdad's most dangerous neighborhoods in a bid to pacify the city.
There are times when you have to stomp down doors, there are times when you don't have to do it. It's just part of war. War is not an easy thing, and we were still, when we're losing as many troops as we're losing, we had a pretty robust insurgency going on, especially in 2006.
Operation Together Forward seemed to have the opposite of the intended effect. By early September, the death toll in Baghdad had actually increased by 300%. Against this backdrop, George Bush made a stunning comment. Speaking on American television, the president said, "When history will be written, the killings in Iraq will look like just a comma." But by October 2006, attacks had escalated by 22% since the beginning of the crackdown. Operation Together Forward also highlighted the limits of Iraqi security forces. Heavily infiltrated by militias, they had become part of the problem rather than part of the solution.
I was afraid of them. Detention was random. If, for example, a military convoy is hit, then the security forces would comb the entire area, arrest whoever comes in their way, even the crippled or the sick. The next day, the family would look for the detainees in hospitals and morgues, so we had to defend ourselves.
In mid-October, a faction of Sunni extremists headed by Al-Qaeda in Iraq announced the formation of the Islamic State in Iraq. Their fighters paraded military style in Ramadi, vowing to create an Islamic caliphate in most of central Iraq, an area in which the Americans had completely lost control. The failure to secure Iraq and quell the violence that spread across the country led to calls for Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld to resign, not only from a generally war-weary public, but from the military's top brass. They publicly denounced him, saying that he'd lost control of the very institution he led and insisted Rumsfeld must go. And the American voters decided that the Republicans too must go. On November 7th, they suffered a crushing defeat in the midterm elections, handing over control of Congress to the Democrats. The very next day, Donald Rumsfeld resigned. He was replaced by former CIA Director Robert Gates. But changes in Washington had no impact in Baghdad. On November 12th, 150 employees were abducted by militiamen in broad daylight from the Sunni-led Ministry of Higher Education. The response was swift and deadly. On November 23rd, 5 car bombs killed 144 Shias in the Mahdi army stronghold of Sadr city. 6 days later, Bush and Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki met in Jordan's capital, Amman. It was a summit between two embattled men who desperately needed to find a way out of the quagmire. But the Amman meeting cost al-Maliki the crucial support of Muqtada al-Sadr, who opposed the summit.
When we distinguished that al-Maliki is depending upon the American support in his work within the Iraqi scene, we decided that working and helping such a government is not helpful for the Iraqis in general.
In the US, Bush was desperately trying to find a new Iraq policy, just as the Iraq Study Group released its report. Led by former Secretary of State James Baker, it recommended that the US should commit to a timetable of withdrawal. Additionally, it urged the US administration to reach out to all parties and to engage its two staunchest regional enemies, Syria and Iran. But for their most infamous enemy in the region, the end was near. On December 30th, before dawn, just as Iraqis were gearing up to celebrate Eid al-Adha, the most important religious festival of the year, Saddam Hussein was sent to the gallows. But even his execution was controversial.
What they did was to cobble together a tribunal which fell between being an international tribunal and an Iraqi court, which carried out a very rapid examination of one isolated incident so that Saddam Hussein could be hanged. That was a catastrophic mistake. What they should have done, as was done with the international tribunals that have been created, was to properly evaluate the record of the past. And then judgment might have been passed. It could even be argued that the process of executing him provided no solace. It didn't resolve anything. It actually made things much worse. It created a martyr.
So much blood had been shed to ratify a modern constitution, but when it came to Saddam's execution, all the rules were cast aside.
Presidency Council is authorized, it's the exclusive party or council who should endorse the death penalty. So all the verdicts, whatever might be the Iraqi courts involved, should be delivered to the Presidency Council for final signature. This is not happening.
There was humongous pressure from all corners on this globe, in the Arab world, from the political elite, from the ruling class, different Arab countries. So that was the huge pressure from all corners, and we have to do it.
It was Nouri al-Maliki who ratified the execution order. On the streets of Sadr city and in the Kurdish north, jubilation, celebrating the death of a tyrant. In Saddam's hometown of Tikrit, tears and sorrow over the loss of their leader. But in the rest of the country, reaction to his death was negligible. People far too concerned with their own tragic hardships. On the last day of the year, American soldier deaths reached the 3,000 mark. Countless numbers of Iraqi lives have been lost. Even more were forced from their homes. Almost 4 years after the invasion, there seemed to be no end to the war.